G'day Year 11s. I just want to go through and have a quick look at an example of a possible assessment topic for this IA3 task. Ultimately, what you're looking for is you're looking to see if you can find a situation where consumers have been treated badly in contract situations and propose what the Australian Consumer Law, the ACCC, can do to support that. So the example I'm going to use for you is, the legal issue is, when you've got something that happens out of the ordinary, like border closures, should a company like Airbnb be able to keep 50% or sometimes more of a person's payment if they can't go ahead and use that contract? Let's say someone's in Brisbane, the border between Brisbane and Sydney is closed, they've paid for an Airbnb in Sydney. Should the Airbnb be able to keep that money? And the answer, while this isn't the answer, the reality is this happened a lot during COVID. So let's think about the nature and scope of this legal issue. Well, you're looking at elements of contract, and particularly possibly around a deposit. Deposit is part of the consideration. Looking at this idea of frustration, what happens when the contract can't be fulfilled, but not because of the fault of either party. So another example of frustration, maybe you've got a contract with a builder, or maybe not a builder is perhaps not the best idea because that might be business, but you've got a contract with a painter to do a painting for you. The painter dies. Well, that's not anyone's fault, but the contract can't be fulfilled, and so both parties would go back to the position that they started with. We'd look then to, in the nature and scope, at the role of the ACCC and how they support Australian consumer law. We might look at unconscionable conduct, because it would be an interesting question is whether, when someone's paid you all the money for a service and that service can't be provided, is it okay to keep that money? And the role of terms of contracts, conditions in a contract, because what will have happened is one of the terms in the contract will have been very specific about this, but is this the right thing? So let's have a look now, move beyond the nature and scope to the first viewpoint. The first viewpoint is, let's consider things from the perspective of the consumer who's lost money. Now, the first thing we can do is have a look at a case study of those people who were impacted. And in this case, there are plenty of stories that talk about customers not getting refunded because of sudden border closures. So you can put together some case studies that show what the legal problem is from their perspective. Now, the big question is, would the legal issue of frustration apply, right? Or this fancy word here, force majeure, like a significant, almost like or similar to act of God, or something that can't be anticipated easily. So how does that play into things? So if you go to this publication, it's quite a neat little publication that means you could talk about whether you thought this was a frustrated contract, or should be considered a frustrated contract for people in there, in that situation. So that's looking at the legal issue from the perspective of the consumer's lost money. Then we could also think about it from the viewpoint of the business. The business thinks they've got clauses that are important in the contract. To what extent can they just be ignored? And if you actually have a look here, you can see we found the Airbnb policy, and it actually sets out exactly what some of the clauses might be. Their strict cancellation clause is that if you might get a full refund if you cancel within 48 hours of booking. So it's going to be pretty quick after you've booked, at least 14 days before. Otherwise, you're only entitled to a 50% refund. That means the accommodation's keeping a lot of money. And you will find there are stories of people who've tried to keep or kept all of the money. So you've got two different perspectives. Now, and you've looked at some legal ideas. You've looked at this idea of act of God or force majeure parts of the contract. You've looked at the terms of a contract. You've looked at this idea of unconscionable conduct. So you've built a nice legal studies analysis through there. The thing that's probably missing just in my short one is some expert legal opinion. So let's have a look at some legal alternatives. One of them is just to legislate and say that absolutely, if there's a clause in a contract, that simply stands. The other is to say, well, maybe we have to do more. The ACCC, so linking to Australian company law, needs to provide a clear definition of what a frustrated contract is and the minimum standards as to the outcomes. So, for example, that the people taking the booking, they've spent some time and effort, so they may be entitled to have their costs refunded up to a maximum value of 15%. Then we move on to the recommendation. So I've got that recommendation saying that there should be more scope for contracts to be considered frustrated. And then we've got to use legal criteria to say that this is a good recommendation, fair and just. So you could look at the Airbnb cases and say, well, actually, the host gets paid some money for their time putting together the booking. The client receives the balance of the refund, both are in a reasonable position. You can also look at the fact that there is that taking this step limits the power of big businesses just to have contract terms that might be unfair. And so there's, as well as the terms of the contract, there's a judgment about what is fair overall. That might be something that's seen positively. And fair and just because it addresses the power imbalance and between a large organisation and a consumer, and it provides a reasonable outcome for both. In a challenging situation, and frustrated contracts are likely to be in challenging situations. Think of the other example, the death of someone. This specific example, COVID-19, where people aren't travelling, neither person is getting what they want out of the situation. Implications, just to remember, implications to meet the highest criteria must be flowing. So ACCC, the implications are the ACCC takes an active role in an important consumer issue. Companies are reminded they cannot write clauses that are not reasonable to both the company and the consumer, and consumers are able to enter into travel accommodation contracts with greater confidence about uncertainty or uncertain events in the future. Okay, so that was the way I had gone through that presentation. So, okay, here's how an issue of consumer being treated badly could be looked at in respect of this assignment.